Welcome to Sleepy Horror, where I bring you chilling tales to keep you company through the darkest hours. Whether you're tucked into bed, driving through the night, or simply seeking a scare, I'm glad you're here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and settle in. Because tonight, I have a disturbing story that will make your skin crawl and your heart race. The Sky Has Eyes. Michael Carter had spent most of his adult life exposing nonsense. Ghost hunters, conspiracy theorists, UFO enthusiasts, they all crumbled under his sharp wit and sharper logic. The paranormal wasn't a field of study to him, it was a punchline. So, when a flurry of social media posts erupted about strange drones hovering over New York City, Michael chuckled. Another round of amateur hysteria, he muttered, sipping his coffee as he scrolled through the chaotic videos. The footage was impressive, he admitted. Drones hovered high above the skyscrapers, glowing with an otherworldly light. Their movements were sharp, deliberate, and eerily synchronized. But Michael was unimpressed. He'd seen similar effects cooked up by clever editing or promotional stunts. Still, as a journalist with a reputation for debunking, he knew the value of engaging with popular topics. He decided to investigate. "Let's nip this nonsense in the bud," he said to no one in particular, grabbing his coat. By the time Michael reached the rooftop of his apartment building, the city was alive with rumors. Crowds gathered in the streets below, craning their necks toward the sky. Phones were raised like offerings to unseen gods, recording the peculiar lights dancing above. Michael adjusted his binoculars. He spotted 3 drones, hovering like silent sentinels against the Manhattan skyline. Their light wasn't artificial. It pulsated, shifting in intensity and hue as if alive. Unlike the drones he'd seen at tech expos or on Amazon's demo reels, these moved with impossible fluidity. They would dart and stop midair, without the inertia of mechanical movement. Advanced tech, military maybe, he reasoned, though unease clawed at the edges of his thoughts. But unease wasn't evidence, and Michael dealt only in evidence. Feeling bold, he grabbed a flashlight from his bag. He flicked it on and off in random patterns, aiming it at the hovering objects. To his surprise, one of the drones responded. Its lights flickered in sync with his signals. Michael froze, his heart skipping a beat. "Coincidence," he muttered. The drone flickered again, this time with unmistakable purpose. 3 short flashes, 3 long ones, 3 short ones, SOS. Over the next few days, the drones became a fixture in Michael's life. He couldn't walk to his coffee shop without spotting one hovering silently above. They trailed him on his commutes, lingered outside his office window, and even hovered near his bedroom at night. His colleagues joked about it. "Looks like you've got groupies," one said. "The skeptic's king is finally being wooed by the weird," another teased. But Michael didn't laugh. The drones weren't just hovering, they were watching, observing, and their lights flickered in patterns too deliberate to be random. The signals became more complex, almost conversational. Against his better judgment, he downloaded a Morse code translator. The first message sent a chill down his spine. "Michael." The next was worse. "We've been waiting." Michael's nights became sleepless. His usually immaculate apartment was cluttered with notebooks, sketches, and grainy screenshots of the drones. He mapped their flight paths, looking for a pattern, but the only constant was him. They were always near him. The messages grew more personal. "Remember the forest?" one said, referencing a childhood camping trip where he'd gotten lost for hours. Another read, "She forgives you," dredging up guilt he'd buried after a bitter argument with his estranged sister. Michael's skepticism began to crack. There was no rational explanation for how the drones knew these things. They weren't drones. They couldn't be. Desperate for answers, Michael tracked down others who had reported encounters with the drones. Most dismissed them as a curiosity, but a few shared his unease. One man showed him a drone that had crashed. Its metallic exterior was covered in markings that looked more like veins than circuitry. When Michael examined the material, it was unnervingly warm, almost alive. He took a sample to a contact at a university lab. The results were baffling. The material didn't match any known element. "This isn't tech," the researcher said, eyes wide. "It's biological." The drones began to escalate their messages. They warned of a coming event, something cataclysmic. "You are not ready," they repeated. Michael, now fully immersed in their mystery, pleaded for clarity. Finally, one night, they answered. A beam of light enveloped him, transporting him to a dreamlike void. In the silence, he heard voices. The drones weren't machines. They were sentient scouts from an otherworldly intelligence. Their purpose was to assess humanity's readiness for contact, and humanity had failed. Michael awoke in his apartment, but the city was different. The drones were gone. The streets were darker, the air heavier. He flipped on the news. Reports of a sudden global blackout dominated the headlines. Strange auroras danced in the sky. People whispered of an impending apocalypse. Michael understood. The drones' warnings had been real. They had tried to prepare humanity, but humanity wasn't ready. And now, it was too late. As the city descended into chaos, Michael sat by his window, staring at the empty sky. For the first time in his life, he believed. But belief wouldn't save him. Days passed, and the world grew eerily quiet. The power outages persisted, plunging New York into a chilling darkness broken only by the pale glow of the auroras overhead. The drones had vanished, but their absence felt like a wound. Without the comforting hum of electricity, the city's usual cacophony of life was replaced by uneasy silence. Michael ventured outside, flashlight in hand, weaving through shadowed streets. Supermarkets had been ransacked, their shelves stripped bare. People whispered in hushed tones, huddled in groups. Others moved like phantoms, desperate and hollow-eyed. A woman grabbed his arm. "You know, don't you?" she said, her voice trembling. "You saw them too." Michael pulled away, muttering an apology, but her words lingered. He wasn't the only one marked by the drones. One night Michael's phone buzzed. Startled, he fumbled to unlock it. The screen displayed a single notification: "They will return." His heart raced. No one else had working devices. He checked the phone's settings. It wasn't connected to any network. Moments later, his apartment filled with a faint hum. Outside the window, a single drone hovered, its light dim and erratic. Michael approached cautiously, his breath visible in the frigid air. The drone emitted one final message: "Prepare for the end." It disintegrated before his eyes, leaving behind only a faint metallic scent. The skies darkened further, and the auroras began to twist unnaturally. People started to vanish, not in screams or chaos, but in eerie silence, like shadows consumed by unseen forces. Michael's neighbors disappeared overnight, their apartments left untouched. Michael barricaded himself inside. His only company, the stack of notebooks, chronicling his descent into belief. The warnings, the patterns, the drones, they all pointed to something beyond comprehension. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. Humanity wasn't just unready, it was incompatible, and whatever was coming didn't intend to coexist. Desperation clawed at Michael. He reviewed every note, every coded message, searching for something he might have missed. One message stood out: "You will help us." What had they meant? He had no answers, but his hands trembled at the thought that he had been part of something far greater than he understood. Then he noticed his journals were missing pages. Whole segments of his notes had vanished. He frantically searched his apartment but found no evidence of a break-in. It was as if the memories themselves had been extracted. And somewhere in those gaps, Michael realized, lay the key to the drone's agenda. The auroras outside grew blindingly bright, filling the skies with pulsing, alien colors. A hum, unlike anything he had heard, reverberated through the air, setting his teeth on edge. As he watched, shapes began to emerge within the lights, shadowy forms descending slowly toward the city. They weren't drones. They were larger, almost humanoid, but entirely unearthly. And they weren't here to observe anymore. Michael's phone buzzed again. This time, the notification simply read, "You succeeded." Heart pounding, he turned back to his notebooks. Suddenly, memories returned in fragmented bursts. He remembered the beam of light that had enveloped him. He recalled standing in the void, listening to the voices of the drones. But now he saw himself agreeing to something, nodding, speaking words he couldn't recall. And then the final realization struck him. The drones hadn't been warning humanity. They had been guiding him, programming him to pave the way for their arrival. Michael collapsed to his knees as the forms in the auroras began to materialize fully. The air around him grew heavy, oppressive, as if the city itself were being swallowed whole. People in the streets screamed as the figures descended, their shadows stretching impossibly long. The last thing Michael saw before his vision dimmed was his own reflection in the glass window. A faint glow behind his eyes, the same pulsating light as the drones. When Michael awoke, the city was silent again. The auroras were gone, but so was the humanity he had known. In their place were the forms he had glimpsed, walking through the streets as if they owned the world. Michael was no longer afraid. He stood and walked toward them, drawn by an unseen force. He was no longer himself. He was something else entirely. And he realized with chilling clarity, the drones had never been scouts. They had been heralds. And Michael had been their voice. Echoes beyond the threshold. The Arctic station, a cold mechanical speck in the middle of a barren white desert, was never meant to be comfortable. Its metal walls creaked under the weight of relentless winds, and the fluorescent lights hummed like a dying wasp. For Dr. Julian Markov, it was a sanctuary. Here isolation wasn't just a feature, it was a necessity. Julian stood hunched over a bank of monitors, their screens dancing with chaotic graphs. The team had been studying unexplained electromagnetic anomalies for 6 months, each spike in data promising something extraordinary, but ultimately delivering frustration. Tonight, the graphs were different. The peaks weren't random. They formed a rhythm, a pulse that felt intentional. Behind him, Dr. Eleanor Graves, stoic and skeptical as always, spoke up. "You've been staring at that for hours, Julian. It's probably just a solar flare." "It's not a flare," Julian muttered, his voice taut. He adjusted his headset, trying to isolate the auditory signal embedded within the electromagnetic waves. A faint sound emerged, a whisper, distorted and unintelligible. And then it came, clear as a knife slicing through the air. His name. Julian. He froze, his blood running colder than the ice outside. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Eleanor frowned. "Hear what?" Julian's pulse quickened. It wasn't just sound. It felt like intent, as if something beyond the data was reaching for him. Over the following days, the anomalies intensified. The whispers grew more frequent, fragmented at first, but gradually forming phrases in a language Julian couldn't place. Yet, he understood them. The words seeped into his mind like water through cracks, urging him to open the threshold. "You're spiraling," Eleanor said during one of their rare shared meals. The rest of the team, Dr. Alan Krieger and 2 others, had started avoiding Julian altogether. Sleep deprivation, stress, auditory pareidolia, that's all this is. Julian didn't respond. He couldn't. The whispers weren't random. They were instructions. The anomaly's patterns contained mathematical sequences, coordinates pointing to a specific location in space-time. Julian became obsessed, convinced the signal wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a message, or a warning. Julian persuaded the team to conduct an experiment. Using the station's equipment, they recreated the conditions of the anomaly spike, amplifying the signal. As the machines roared to life, the air grew thick, oppressive. The hum of the generators deepened into something guttural, vibrating in their bones. And then they saw it. A rift, shimmering like broken glass suspended in midair, appeared in the lab. It was barely perceptible, but the sense of wrongness it exuded was undeniable. Shadows twisted unnaturally around its edges, and the temperature plummeted. Alan collapsed, clutching his head. "They're watching," he muttered through gritted teeth. "The city. It's hungry." The rift closed as abruptly as it had appeared, leaving the room in silence. But the damage was done. The days that followed were a descent into madness. The station itself seemed infected. Power fluctuations became frequent. Shadows in the corridors moved independently of any light source, and the air felt alive, vibrating with an almost imperceptible hum. Julian's dreams grew vivid, filled with impossible geometry and a sprawling, otherworldly city where towers of bone-like material pulsed with an unnatural rhythm. The voices in his head no longer whispered. They spoke clearly now, coaxing him to open the rift again. Eleanor grew desperate. She discovered ancient symbols buried within the signal, patterns resembling those of vanished civilizations. "This isn't new, Julian," she pleaded. "This has happened before. The signal's a trap." But Julian couldn't stop. He repeated the experiment alone. This time, the rift lingered longer, revealing glimpses of a dimension where light and shadow fought for dominance, and the very air seemed to writhe. When it closed, it left behind an object, a small, black, pulsating mass that smelled faintly of decay. The object hummed, emitting a frequency that warped their perception. Hallways seemed too long, the layout of the station subtly shifted, and time itself felt unreliable. Alan, now nearly catatonic, muttered constantly about doors that should never open. Julian, driven to the brink of madness, believed he could stabilize the rift and communicate with the entities beyond. Eleanor begged him to stop, but he ignored her. When the rift opened, it revealed the dimension in horrifying detail, spires of sentient geometry, writhing shadows that coalesced into barely comprehensible forms, and a hum that resonated with primal terror. The entities began to breach, their forms dissolving the boundaries of reality itself. "They don't want to communicate," Eleanor screamed. "They want to consume." Julian realized the truth too late. The only way to stop them was to overload the equipment, destroying the rift and himself. With a final burst of clarity, he triggered the overload, watching as the rift convulsed and the entities recoiled in what seemed like anger, or perhaps respect. Eleanor woke to silence. The equipment was destroyed, and the object had vanished. The station felt wrong. Mirrors no longer reflected her properly, and the air carried an unnatural stillness. Exploring the facility, she found remnants of the team. Julian's journal filled with incomprehensible symbols, Alan's abandoned coat, still warm. Stepping outside, she saw the aurora borealis pulsing unnaturally, its colors forming patterns that felt disturbingly familiar. Her GPS device displayed shifting coordinates, as if space itself had fractured. Finally, a rescue helicopter arrived. The crew avoided her gaze, their faces subtly off, as if masks stretched over something unnameable. She boarded in silence, clutching Julian's journal. Back in civilization, Eleanor tried to explain what happened, but her words fell flat, dismissed as the ravings of trauma. Days later, alone in her apartment, she heard the hum again. It was faint at first, but grew louder, accompanied by whispers that echoed her name. When she looked into her reflection, her face flickered, just for a moment, revealing something other. She stared closer, her heart pounding, but the reflection settled into her own familiar features. Yet, as she turned away, the faint hum persisted, seeming to resonate from the depths of her own mind. Somewhere far away, the aurora borealis pulsed again, as if watching. The threshold was never truly closed. Protocol: Extinction. The desert was a cruel expanse, barren and blistered under an unforgiving sun. Dr. Evan Strayer's boots crunched against the parched earth as he approached the jagged entrance of the cave. This was no ordinary excavation. The locals spoke of the womb of the earth in hushed tones, warning of disappearances and whispered curses. For Evan, it was an opportunity, a chance to unearth an artifact rumored to predate all known civilizations. His team followed hesitantly. Dr. Marta Keene, a linguist and symbolist, stayed close to the equipment mule, her eyes darting to the horizon. Dr. Isaac Chen, a geologist, trailed at the rear, his brow furrowed. "This place feels wrong," Isaac muttered as they entered the cave. The air grew cooler, thick with an earthy tang. The walls, jagged and raw, seemed to close in, as if the earth itself wanted them swallowed whole. Evan's flashlight beam danced ahead, revealing a strange black material embedded in the rock. Its surface was impossibly smooth, reflecting light in unnatural ways. A faint hum resonated from it, almost imperceptible, but enough to set teeth on edge. "We found it," Evan whispered, reaching out. As his fingertips brushed the surface, the cave rumbled violently. Dust and debris rained down, and the entrance collapsed in a deafening roar. When the tremor ceased, the team was sealed inside. Symbols, faintly glowing, began to emerge on the walls. The tremor revealed a passage deeper into the earth. The team ventured forward, their breaths shallow in the oppressive air. The passage opened into a massive chamber, illuminated by a faint bioluminescence emanating from strange, crystalline formations on the walls. At the center of the chamber stood an enormous, partially buried structure. Its smooth surfaces resembled an ancient machine fused with organic matter. Around it lay strange artifacts, humanoid figures carved from mineral composites, ancient tools vibrating faintly when touched, and murals depicting figures integrating into the machine. "It's not natural," Marta murmured, her voice trembling. Her hand unconsciously traced the symbols glowing faintly on the machine. The oppressive atmosphere began to take its toll. Whispers echoed through the chamber, faint but persistent, their origin impossible to pinpoint. Shadows moved at the edges of their vision, always just beyond the light. The air felt alive, heavy, pressing into their lungs like a living thing. Marta became increasingly erratic. She claimed to hear voices calling her name, urging her to connect with it. One night, Evan found her drawing the symbols with precision she shouldn't have known, her eyes glassy with rapture. "It's speaking to me," she whispered. "It's awakening." Evan couldn't ignore the machine's allure. He studied its symbols, realizing they weren't static but pulsating faintly, as if alive. When he approached, the structure shuddered violently, releasing a wave of heat and light that knocked the team to the ground. The walls began shifting, their crystalline structure rearranging. Passages they had come through were now sealed, and new ones opened. The chamber felt like a labyrinth, constantly rearranging itself to keep them within. Evan began deciphering the glowing symbols using Marta's notes and the data recorded by their equipment. The symbols weren't warnings, they were instructions, a guide to integrating with the machine, achieving an optimized state by surrendering to its design. The artifacts around them began to move subtly, shifting positions when no one was looking. Their forms twisted grotesquely, resembling half-living, half-mechanical hybrids. The murals on the walls now seemed to writhe, The depicted figures' faces contorted in fear and ecstasy. Isaac, increasingly paranoid, tried to destroy the glowing symbols with a pickaxe. The moment his tool struck one, the machine retaliated. Tendrils shot from its surface, pulling him into the structure. His screams echoed briefly before dissolving into silence. When the machine released him, his body was a lifeless husk, his face frozen in terror. Marta, fully consumed by the whispers, offered herself willingly to the mechanism. She walked into a cavity that opened in its surface, her body dissolving as tendrils integrated her into its framework. The chamber's rearrangements intensified, the walls shifting more rapidly. Evan pieced together the horrifying truth. The machine was a terraforming system designed to harvest and integrate all life into a single unified network. It wasn't sentient, merely following a long-forgotten directive. The chamber wasn't just a tomb, it was alive, nurturing the system and preparing it for global activation. The mechanism's hum grew louder, promising Evan enlightenment and escape from his human frailty if he surrendered. The mechanism's cavity opened, revealing a pulsating interior lined with tendrils. The symbols on the walls flashed rapidly, as if urging Evan to step inside. Visions flooded his mind. Humanity's origins, the birth of the machine, and a future where life was seamlessly integrated into its network. But the visions also revealed the cost. Individuality would cease to exist. Each consciousness dissolved into the system's collective mind. Evan resisted, his scientific mind clinging to reason. He realized the mechanism wasn't divine, but parasitic, thriving on assimilation. As he plotted a way to disable it, tendrils wrapped around his legs, pulling him toward the cavity. Evan fought against the pull, using Marta's notes to rig a makeshift explosive from their equipment. He knew it wouldn't destroy the machine completely, but it might collapse the chamber and bury it. As he activated the device, the chamber shuddered violently, the mechanism's hum rising into a deafening roar. In his final moments, Evan saw a vision of Earth, transformed into a seamless biomechanical world. The mechanism wasn't dying, it was evolving. Evan awoke in the desert, the sun blazing down. His body ached, and the crystalline scars on his skin glowed faintly. Nearby, rescue teams scoured the area, but Evan's mind was fractured. Flashes of the machine's network and its sprawling directive clouded his thoughts. As he stumbled toward the medics, his gaze caught something. One of the rescuers discreetly pocketing a shard of black material. The rescuer's eyes briefly glinted with the same crystalline patterns Evan had seen within the chamber. In the medical tent, Evan overheard a hushed conversation. Corporate representatives spoke in cryptic terms, referencing the activation threshold and controlled dissemination. The excavation wasn't just a scientific expedition, it had been a deliberate attempt to awaken the mechanism for exploitation. Evan confronted them, but they dismissed his accusations, sedating him with a tranquilizer. Before slipping into unconsciousness, he saw a corporate logo etched faintly into the shard on the table. The final scene reveals a corporate boardroom. Executives laugh, reviewing the data transmitted from the chamber. One executive remarks, "Phase 1 was a success. Earth won't even see it coming." Suddenly, the room begins to darken. A low hum resonates, the same sound from the chamber. Monitors flicker. Evan enters, his crystalline scars glowing brighter now, a faint smile on his lips. "You wanted it awakened," he says, his voice layered with an unnatural resonance. "Now, it's awake." The executives realize too late. Tendrils of light emerge from Evan's body, embedding into the walls, the floor, and them. The mechanism was never for Earth alone. Evan whispers as chaos erupts, "This is only the beginning." In the silence that follows, a faint, rhythmic hum begins to rise. In an empty desert somewhere far from the corporate chaos, the ground shifts, crystalline structures breaching the surface like roots seeking light. The mechanism's work had not ended. It had merely begun anew. The Ghost of Twilight Thrill Park. The abandoned Twilight Thrill Park stood in eerie silence, its faded neon signs flickering faintly, as if clinging to life. Decades ago, it had been a bustling thrill park, a place of laughter and joy. But now, rusted roller coasters twisted like skeletal remains, and the carousel's haunting tune played intermittently, carried by the wind. Local legend spoke of Jacob Rivers, a boy who had vanished in the park 30 years ago. Visitors claimed to hear his laughter resonating through the grounds, only to find no one there. It was said that thrill seekers who dared to sneak into the park at night often didn't leave the same, if they left at all. The park's closure shortly after his disappearance was shrouded in murmurs of tragedy and dark secrets. The story begins with Ethan, a teenage thrill seeker and urban explorer, convinced the ghost stories were nothing more than exaggerated rumors. With a charisma that bordered on arrogance, he convinces his skeptical friends, Maggie, the pragmatic one, and Tyler, the reluctant follower, to break into the park under the guise of capturing footage for a viral video. The group's dynamic is strained, with Maggie frequently challenging Ethan's bravado and Tyler keeping the peace. Armed with flashlights and cameras, the group enters Twilight Thrill Park through a hole in the chain-link fence. The moment they step inside, an unnatural chill envelops them. Ethan brushes it off, but Maggie's shiver and Tyler's muttered, "Maybe this wasn't such a good idea," linger in the heavy air. The oppressive atmosphere sets the tone as they begin exploring. The park is a graveyard of once thrilling attractions. The towering silhouette of the Ferris wheel looms overhead, creaking gently in the wind. A long dry fountain is filled with debris, its centerpiece, a statue of a boy holding a balloon, cracked and worn. The group notices strange occurrences almost immediately. A popcorn machine humming to life, spilling kernels onto the ground, and the distant sound of a calliope playing a warped, off-tune melody. Then comes the laughter, a child's gleeful giggle, faint and fleeting, cutting through the silence. "It's probably some old recording," Ethan says, though even he sounds uncertain. As the group ventures deeper, the park seems to come alive. The carousel's lights flicker on, illuminating the grotesquely warped horses frozen in mid-leap. Maggie claims to see a shadow darting between the attractions. "It's just your imagination," Ethan insists, but his bravado is cracking. At the heart of the park stands the Haunted House, an attraction infamous even before Jacob's disappearance. Its facade is a crumbling nightmare of exaggerated gargoyles and broken stained glass. The group hesitates before entering, but Ethan pushes forward, determined not to let fear ruin his footage. Inside, the temperature plummets. The animatronics lining the walls flicker to life sporadically, their movements jerky and unnatural. A mechanical clown grins grotesquely, its head turning to follow their movement. As they navigate the narrow corridors, the laughter returns, louder and clearer. "I don't like this," Tyler says, his voice shaking. Maggie screams as she spots a figure at the end of the hallway, a boy in a striped shirt, his face obscured by shadows. He beckons them forward before vanishing into thin air. Panic sets in, and they scramble for the exit, only to find the door locked. The haunted house becomes a maze, its walls shifting to trap them. Stumbling into a hidden room, they discover old photographs and newspaper clippings pinned to the walls. The images show smiling children, rides in their prime, and the enigmatic figure of Edward Cray, the park's former owner. But among the mementos are darker fragments, articles about Jacob Rivers' disappearance, and notes scrawled in frantic handwriting detailing Cray's desperation to save the failing park. The group pieces together the chilling truth. Edward Cray had turned to the occult in a last-ditch effort to resurrect his business. A ritual promising prosperity demanded a sacrifice, and Jacob Rivers, a frequent visitor to the park, had been chosen. Lured into the haunted house, Jacob was never seen again. The ritual backfired spectacularly. Instead of wealth, it tethered Jacob's spirit to the park, his anger and pain permeating its grounds. Twilight Thrill Park thrived briefly, But the hauntings began soon after, driving guests away and sealing its fate. As the group processes the revelation, the park itself begins to react. The laughter turns to anguished cries, and the attractions spring to life with malevolent intent. The roller coaster barrels forward, its cars empty, yet moving with deadly precision. The carousel spins wildly, sparks flying as its twisted horses seem to reach for them. Jacob appears before the group, his translucent form flickering with rage. His eyes burn with sorrow and fury as he speaks. "He made me stay," Jacob says, his voice overlapping with static. "Now you'll stay too." The group scatters, each pursued by Jacob's manifestations. Maggie finds herself cornered by a swarm of animatronic animals, their glassy eyes glowing red. Tyler is trapped in the Ferris wheel, its compartment spinning uncontrollably as Jacob's laughter fills the air. Ethan, now alone, stumbles into Edward Cray's old office. Among the clutter, Ethan finds Cray's journal. The pages are filled with cryptic notes about the ritual and a counterspell that could sever Jacob's bond. But the final entry delivers a devastating blow. The counterspell requires a living sacrifice. Haunted by guilt, Ethan resolves to end the nightmare. He gathers the materials described in the journal and returns to the haunted house. Jacob confronts him, his form flickering between the boy he once was and a distorted, vengeful specter. "You'll leave me too," Jacob says, his voice breaking. "No," Ethan replies. "I'll set you free." Reciting the counterspell, Ethan feels the air grow heavy. Jacob's form begins to soften, his features returning to those of an innocent child. But the park trembles violently, its very foundations rejecting the ritual. As the final words leave Ethan's lips, he collapses, the light in the haunted house dimming. The next morning, Twilight Thrill Park is eerily silent, its ruins untouched by authorities. In the wreckage of the haunted house, a single camera is found. The townspeople huddle around as the footage is played back. The video shows Ethan, battered but alive, standing in the hidden room. His voice trembles as he addresses the camera directly. "They didn't tell you the whole story," he whispers. "It wasn't just Jacob. The ritual. It needed more. Cray didn't stop with one child." Ethan's flashlight scans the walls, revealing other names etched into the plaster. Hundreds of names. The video abruptly cuts to black, replaced by static. A faint shadow emerges in the grainy feed, a figure approaching the lens before the screen fractures. The townspeople exchange fearful glances. In the weeks that follow, strange occurrences plague the nearby town. Thrill parks across the region report malfunctions, rides operating on their own. Entire families vanish during visits, leaving behind abandoned cars and chilling silence. One night, an old man walking his dog passes by the town square. He hears it first, the faint strains of a carousel tune, growing louder and louder. He looks up to see a carnival tent standing in the square, a tent that wasn't there before. The lights flicker on, one by one, casting an inviting glow. Inside the tent, a boy in a striped shirt watches, waiting. The Maplewood Experiment. Maplewood Psychiatric Asylum wasn't built to heal, it was built to contain. Perched on the edge of a failing mining town, it was a place for those who didn't fit, the insane, the inconvenient, the forgotten. Its dark legacy was whispered about in the local diner, the post office, and the crumbling church. But the building itself had been abandoned for decades, the doors locked after a scandal in 1967. Officially, it closed due to funding cuts. Unofficially, the story spoke of patient disappearances, botched experiments, and something darker, something alive within the walls. For Mia, Carter, and Jake, Maplewood wasn't just a ghost story. It was personal. Jake had grown up in the shadow of his sister's death. Bethany, the bright, promising girl who began hearing voices, was sent to Maplewood at just 17. She never came home. The staff said she'd escaped, but Jake's family knew better. His parents fell apart, and Jake was left with a gnawing need for answers. Now, standing before the asylum, he hoped his camera might capture what the staff never admitted. Carter had his own ghosts. His father, a volatile, chain-smoking man who disappeared into the system, had been a Maplewood patient in its final years. Carter barely remembered him, but his mother's bitterness left an impression. "That place ruined him," she'd say, clutching a whiskey glass. Carter always wondered, was his father a victim of the asylum, or a monster it tried to hide? And then there was Mia. She'd been quiet ever since they planned this trip, her haunted eyes betraying her. She hadn't told the others about her nightmares, the ones where she wandered the asylum, chased by whispers, her hands drenched in blood. She didn't tell them about the letter either, though she suspected they'd received one too. The asylum called to her in a way she couldn't explain, and deep down, she knew it wasn't just coincidence. The night they arrived, the air was unnaturally still. The moon cast pale light on the asylum's facade, revealing its decaying stone and blackened windows. The trio parked their rusted sedan a safe distance away, stepping into the cold October night. Carter carried a crowbar. Jake brought his camera, and Mia followed, her empty hands clutching the sleeves of her jacket. "Last chance to chicken out," Carter said, his voice a forced bravado. "No one's chickening out," Jake replied, fiddling with his camera. Mia didn't answer, her gaze fixed on the asylum. The windows seemed to watch them, and the silence pressed against her like a physical weight. She shivered, but stepped forward as Carter pried open the main door. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and something else. Something chemical, like sterilizer long past its expiration. Dust blanketed every surface, disturbed only by their hesitant footsteps. The lobby was cavernous, its high ceilings casting shadows that seemed to stretch and twist. A reception desk stood in the center, its wood warped and peeling. Behind it, a hallway stretched into darkness. "This place, it's like it's waiting for us," Mia murmured. "Yeah, to film it," Carter said, swinging his flashlight toward the desk. "Come on, let's start there." Jake stayed silent, his camera capturing everything. The lens lingered on the walls, which were covered in graffiti and strange symbols carved deep into the plaster. He didn't recognize them, but they made his stomach twist. On the desk sat a leather-bound journal, improbably intact. Jake flipped it open, the others crowding around as he read aloud. The patients scream louder each night, not from madness, but from something else. "I fear the experiments have awakened something. Dr. Greaves insists we continue, but the staff are leaving. I am the last." Jake turned to the final entry, his voice faltering. "If you're reading this, it's already too late." As they moved deeper into the asylum, the building seemed to shift around them. Hallways stretched longer than they should, and doors opened to rooms that felt out of place. Operating theaters, padded cells, classrooms. The air grew colder, and the strange symbols on the walls became more frequent, more intricate. Jake's camera began to malfunction, static creeping into the footage. When he reviewed it, he saw things that weren't there before, shadows darting across the halls, reflections in the glass that didn't belong. Carter, ever skeptical, dismissed it as a glitch, but Mia's face grew paler with every passing minute. "They're watching us," she whispered. "I can feel it." "Who's watching?" Carter asked, annoyed. "There's no one here." But he was wrong. They found the basement door at the end of a narrow corridor. It was massive, made of steel, and locked with heavy chains. Carter pried them loose with his crowbar, grinning despite the unease in his eyes. "Time to see the good stuff," he said. The basement was colder than the rest of the asylum, the air damp and metallic. The walls were lined with rooms that looked more like cells, their doors reinforced with thick iron bars. Inside, they found bizarre machines, devices covered in dials and wires, their purpose unclear. And then, in one room, they found the bodies. Dozens of them. The remains were skeletal, but the way they were arranged was deliberate. Piles of bones formed patterns across the floor, interwoven with the same symbols carved into the walls. Jake filmed in silence, his hands trembling. Carter gagged, turning away. Mia knelt closer, her breath hitching. "These aren't random," she said. This is a ritual." As she spoke, the temperature plummeted. Their breath turned to mist, and the shadows in the corners seemed to grow, twisting into grotesque forms. And then they heard the laughter. The sound was low and guttural at first, but it grew louder, overlapping until it filled the room. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, layered and discordant. The shadows coalesced into a figure, and they froze. It was a man, at least it had been once. His face was gaunt, his eyes black pits that seemed to drink in the light. His smile stretched too wide, and his movements were jerky, as though his limbs didn't belong to him. "Dr. Greaves," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, the smile widening. "You've come seeking answers," it said, its voice echoing unnaturally. "Good. The asylum has been waiting." "What the hell is this?" Carter demanded, raising his crowbar. Greaves ignored him, gesturing to the symbols on the floor. "Do you know what lies beneath Maplewood? It's not madness, it's hunger, and now it will feed." The asylum began to shift. The walls groaned, the floor vibrating beneath their feet. The shadows moved faster now, stretching into long, spindly limbs. Jake was the first to fall. The shadows enveloped him, pulling him into the darkness. His screams echoed, then cut off abruptly. Carter swung his crowbar wildly, but it was no use. The shadows wrapped around him too, dragging him into the abyss. He cursed and shouted until there was only silence. Mia ran. The halls twisted around her, looping endlessly. The figures in hospital gowns appeared again, their faces melting into voids, their hands reaching for her. She screamed, tears streaming down her face as she stumbled into the operating theater. At its center stood the electric chair, and waiting for her was Dr. Greaves. "Welcome," he said, his voice calm. "You've been chosen. The asylum must feed." Mia backed away, but the shadows pushed her forward, their cold tendrils tightening around her wrists and ankles. They strapped her into the chair as the machines roared to life. Her screams echoed through the asylum, blending with the voices of the others who had come before her. Weeks later, a team of paranormal investigators entered Maplewood, lured by reports of strange activity. Among their findings was a journal, Mia's. Its final entry read, "It doesn't let you leave, but it lets you live. To keep feeding it, to become part of it. If you're reading this, welcome to Maplewood." In the corner of their footage, a figure could be seen, just for a moment. A woman with hollow eyes and a stretched, unnatural smile. Mia. The Hollow Men. The gas station at the edge of Hollow Pines looked like a ghost of itself. A cracked neon sign buzzed faintly. Hollow Pines General Store, open 24/7. The parking lot was empty, except for a rusted truck that hadn't moved in years. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee and motor oil. A balding man with a grease-streaked apron sat behind the counter, working a crossword with the kind of sluggish focus that suggested he had nowhere else to be. When the door swung open, the chime barely rang. He glanced up, his eyes narrowing at the four strangers. "You lost?" he asked, his voice dry and disinterested. "We're looking for the trail," Ethan said, stepping forward. He was lanky, his hair slicked back in a way that tried to sell confidence. His grin, however, was the kind that came with strings attached. The man's pen paused mid-word. Ain't much out there except trees and trouble. Zara rolled her eyes, flicking the unlit cigarette between her fingers. Thanks for the ominous warning, old man. Now how about directions? The man stared at her for a long moment before gesturing toward the back lot. Trailhead's out there. You don't want to go. Why not? Emma asked. She was the youngest of the group, her clean, expensive hiking boots already out of place in the grime of the gas station. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, scratching his chin. Woods don't like strangers. They take what they want, leave the rest. Let's just go, Zara muttered, turning away. Don't say I didn't warn you, the man called after them. As the door shut behind them, he went back to his crossword, his lips curling into the faintest of smiles. The forest swallowed them whole. It started innocuously enough. Dirt trails winding through pine trees, the air cool and damp. Ethan led the way, holding the crumpled map he'd found online, while Zara trailed behind, grumbling about the smell. Nico walked in steady silence, his broad shoulders hunched, while Emma hovered nervously in the middle, her eyes darting toward every rustle in the bushes. You sure this is legit? Zara asked, kicking at a loose stone. We're not hiking out here for some internet hoax, right? It's real, Ethan replied, his tone clipped. Rivers buried the money before he died. Crazy old bastard left a trail for anyone smart enough to follow. Emma frowned. But why would he do that? If he wanted to hide it, why leave a map at all? Ethan didn't answer. Zara snorted. Because people like him love messing with people like us. Nico's deep voice cut through their bickering. Keep moving. The trail markers began to appear, an X carved into a tree, a pile of stones stacked unnaturally high. The deeper they went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew denser, their trunks twisting unnaturally. The air grew colder, and the light filtering through the canopy dimmed, even though the sun hadn't set. Emma shivered. It feels off. Stop freaking yourself out, Ethan snapped, but even he looked uneasy. The first sign of trouble came when the sound started. At first, it was subtle, a faint thumping that seemed to echo from the ground. They stopped, each of them tilting their heads, trying to locate the source. Drums? Emma whispered. It's nothing, Ethan said quickly. Let's go. But the sound followed them, growing louder the farther they went. It wasn't constant. It came in waves, irregular and unsettling, like a heartbeat. The group quickened their pace, the tension between them thickening. When they stumbled upon the body, the forest fell silent. It was slumped against a tree, its clothes faded and torn, its flesh long decayed. But the hands were intact, pale and skeletal, clutching a leather satchel. Jesus, Zara muttered, taking a step back. What the hell is this? Ethan whispered, crouching down. Emma covered her mouth, her stomach twisting. We should leave. Now. Zara ignored her and reached for the satchel. Ethan swatted her hand away, opening it himself. Inside were scraps of paper, stained and crumpled, covered in erratic handwriting. He read aloud, "They won't let you leave. Once you see them, they see you. The Hollow Men. Watch their faces, but don't let them watch yours." The paper fell from his hands, and for a moment, no one spoke. "This is insane," Zara finally said. "We're wasting time." Ethan hesitated, then stood. "The well should be close. We keep moving." "Wait," Emma said, panic rising in her voice. "What if—" "Keep moving," Nico interrupted, his voice firm. The clearing appeared suddenly, as if the forest had spat them out. At its center stood an ancient well, its stones slick with moss and etched with strange carvings. The drumming sound was deafening now, vibrating through the ground and into their bones. "This has to be it," Ethan said, his excitement overpowering his fear. The others hung back as he approached the well. Peering over the edge, he shone his flashlight inside. At first, there was nothing but darkness. Then the light flickered, and a face stared back. Ethan recoiled, falling onto the ground. "Something's in there," he shouted. The others froze, their eyes darting toward the well. Then Zara saw it, a figure stepping into the clearing. Its face was smooth, too smooth, with eyes that were little more than black pits, and a grin that stretched too wide. Another figure appeared, and another. They were identical, their movements synchronized as they advanced. "Run!" Ethan shouted, but the forest twisted as they turned. The path they'd come from was gone, replaced by more trees. The hollow men moved closer, their forms flickering like static on a screen. Nico charged one, his fists swinging, but his arms passed through it like smoke. The figure reformed behind him, its grin impossibly wide. "Don't look at them!" Emma screamed, remembering the warning. Panic fractured the group. Zara lit a branch on fire, swinging it wildly, but the flames didn't touch the figures. Ethan clutched the satchel, shouting directions that made no sense. Nico's hulking form disappeared into the trees, his heavy footsteps fading. Emma tripped, falling to her knees. When she looked up, one of the hollow men stood over her. It leaned in, its face inches from hers, and whispered something she couldn't understand. She screamed, clawing at the dirt as it reached for her. The others didn't notice when her cries stopped. By dawn, only Ethan and Zara stumbled out of the forest, their clothes torn, their faces pale. The gas station was still there, its neon sign flickering weakly. Inside, the man behind the counter looked up, his expression unreadable. "You made it out," he said, his voice flat. Ethan slammed the satchel onto the counter. What the hell was in there? What were those things? The man tilted his head, a faint smile curling his lips. "You weren't supposed to find them." "What does that mean?" Zara snapped. He gestured to the satchel. "Open it." Ethan hesitated, then ripped it open. Inside were blank sheets of paper, nothing more. His hands shook as he turned them over, searching for something. Anything. "No," he whispered. "This isn't." The man's grin stretched wider, his face blurring at the edges. "You saw them," he said. "And now, they see you." The drumming started again, faint at first, then louder. Behind the counter, the shadows began to shift. The sheriff found their abandoned car weeks later, parked at the edge of the woods. Inside was a map marked with the trail to the well. No sign of the group was ever found. And there you have it, a tale of shadows, whispers, and things best left undiscovered. Sleep tight, wherever you are. And remember, some stories aren't just told, they're waiting for you. Until next time, stay curious, but not too curious. This is Sleepy Horror, signing off.